You're listening to WHPK 88.5 FM, the pride of the South Side. This is Radical Minds. Today we have a wonderful show for you. We are interviewing Jonathan Sperber. Let me see if I've got Jonathan on the line. Jonathan, can you hear me? Let me see now. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay, now we've got you. Okay, wonderful. And so I am Spencer Leonard, and I'm your host on Radical Minds. As I say, today we are interviewing Professor Jonathan Sperber on his new book, Karl Marx, A 19th Century Life. And we're going to be interviewing Professor Sperber for the whole hour. Welcome to the show.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here.
Excellent, excellent. Also in the studio is my co-host, Sunit Singh. And I think we've got a lot to talk about. It's a big, rich book. I encourage everyone to go out and get a copy. It's published by Liverite.
That's an imprint of W.W. Norton.
Right. So it's published by Liverite Publishing Company and a division of W.W. Norton, 2013. And it's available at fine bookstores everywhere, and of course Amazon for the vast majority of us.
Right. Let me add to your listeners' edification. It's available as an ebook, and in 2014 there will be a paperback coming out too.
Good. But most of you won't want to wait for the paperback, hopefully.
That's true.
Let me start off just by asking you a very general question. As you've seen the detailed questions that we've sent you, but just a broad sense for our listeners. You've written, since it's in the subtitle, that this is a 19th century life. That you're placing Marx in his context. That Marx is not our contemporary, that he is, that he's best understood in the 19th century, and that, and you've written, if Marx is not our contemporary, but more a figure of the past than a prophet of the present, one might ask why anyone should write a new biography of him, or once that biography exists, why bother reading it?
Well, I guess one answer would be, why should anybody bother writing a new biography of Martin Luther, or of Jesus, or of Charles Darwin, or of Aristotle, or Bismarck, or any other great figure of the past? Mm-hmm. We do this for a number of reasons. One is that they're a cool story, or an interesting life is an interesting story. The other, and I think this is something historians believe, that delineating differences from the past help us to understand the present better. And that was part of what I was trying to do with this book.
Mm-hmm. And in particular, you highlight the way in which this is the case for the 19th century, that the 19th century is in some sense, fading into the past, and in other ways the 19th century is perhaps with us still in a manner that is distinctive.
Yeah, there's a German author, Jürgen Osterhammel, who's written this absolutely fabulous global history of the 19th century. It's called in German Die Verwandlung der Welt. Being translated into English, it's going to appear as the transformation of the world. And one of the things Osterhammel says, and I just love this quote, is that the 19th century is sometimes extremely close to us, but it's more often very distant. Sometimes it's the origins of today, and at other times it appears sunken like Atlantis. That's such a great way to put it, and that's really how I look at Marx. There are some occasions in which Marx seems close and relevant, in which his ideas speak to contemporary concerns, but frankly, most of the time when we look at them, particularly stripped of their 20th century reinterpretations, we find somebody who is dealing with rather a different historical era than our own, and different problems and different issues, using the same words, talking about capitalism, but meaning something very different from today's global capitalist economy.
And now I'm going to turn it over to Sunit for the next question. Here's Sunit.
Okay. Jonathan, I'd like to take you...
Can you raise your voice a bit? You're fading on this end.
Sure thing. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. I suppose one of the first questions that I'd like to open up our conversation with is, the trajectory of Marx's career in some sense. And when he was confronted with the reality that the possibility of a university career was foreclosed, once Friedrich Wilhelm IV initiated a rightward and kind of anti-Hegelian shift from about 1840, Marx turned to work as a journalist and an editor, as you lay out. You describe Marx, the crusading young newspaper man, as follows. Marx blasted the enemies of the freedom of the press, linking their arguments to an archaic society of orders, to an authoritarian Prussian state trying to prop up this society, and to intellectual trends defending it. He also set about praising freedom of the press as part of a broader encomium of freedom, articulated in opposition to the nature of the Prussian monarchy and the debates on freedom of the press in the recently concluded Rhineische Provincial Diet. Marx brought together liberal aspirations for an effective legislature and for a constitution of guaranteeing basic rights such as freedom of the press and liberal hostility to the society of orders, arguing in Hegelian fashion a free press as the objectification of the people's spirit and not an objectification alienated from its spirit, but one that knew itself as such. So thus, as an editor of the Rhineland News, Marx adopted a liberal, what you refer to as a liberal, anti-protectionist, and even anti-communist stance that the bourgeois liberals who were financing the newspaper could rally around. Moreover, this commitment to free trade, or even his criticisms of communism, were, on your account, not the ideas of a liberal youth that Marx would eventually discard. So I was wondering if you could elaborate what were the ways in which Marx's formative political experiences, what were Marx's formative political experiences, and how your book, Karl Marx and 19th Century Life, reframes our understanding of those.
Well, there are a number of areas in which I put Marx's formative political experiences. Perhaps I could mention four of them. One was his relationship with the Prussian monarchy. Marx was born in Trier, a city which had been annexed by the Prussians at the time of the Congress of Vienna, a city whose inhabitants were deeply hostile to Prussia. Marx was himself profoundly ambivalent about Prussia. As a young Hegelian, he looked to Prussia as a source of liberalism and reform, of enlightened ideas. He had great hopes for Prussia. Like all the young Hegelians, he would be deeply disappointed and become a strong enemy of Prussia. Another source, I think, of Marx's shaping was, of course, the ideas of Hegel. Everybody knows that Hegelian ideas, and particularly as they were interpreted or reinterpreted by the radical young Hegelians, shaped Marx's views of historical process and social and political struggle. The third thing I'd say was Marx's confrontation with the ideas of classical political economy, the ideas of people like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, Smith's most important disciples, as well as others like the James and John Stuart Mill. We see this in a very early form here in Marx's advocacy of free trade, which was something he maintained all his life. He was always a free trader, even when he was a communist. And finally, it's in Marx's confrontation with the French Revolution, the dominant political event of the first two-thirds of the 19th century. These things were Marx's formative political experiences, and his theory that he developed was an effort to combine all four of them into a cohesive view of the sort of past development and future trends of European history. I guess the way I put Marx's efforts was, it reminds me a little bit of what happens when you put a cat in a box. You know, cats like boxes. They often climb into boxes even if the box is not quite big enough for them, and they contort their body, but there's always some piece sticking out. Marx's effort to combine all four of these intellectual shaping trends into his grand theory tended to leave, one way or another, one of those pieces sticking out a bit.
It would be a bit like herding a stray cat, perhaps.
Well, that's not just herding the cat. It's like, you may not know this about cats, but my wife and I have two. They just love to get into boxes, and, but even if the box is too small for them, they keep trying to put their whole body in there, and something's always sticking out. And Marx just kept trying to do that, bring those four together, but something did tend to stick out and not quite fit.
Jonathan, let me take up the the relationship, this is obviously a very tortured question, but one that you deal with in very political terms, which I find to be illuminating. You argue that as Marx's criticisms of his erstwhile young Hegelian cohort developed, and of course one of those, Engels, became his close collaborator. He wasn't opposed to all young Hegelians, but as his criticisms of the majority of the young Hegelian cohort developed, as he served as an editor of the Rhineland News, he really focused on their lifestyle-based radicalism. How did this and Marx's evolving critique of the young Hegelians develop into more politically pointed criticism of his fellow socialists during the years in which Marx completed his political education in Paris and Brussels?
That's a good question. What Marx disliked about the young Hegelians as he saw them developing after they're basically his old friends from Berlin after he'd moved to Cologne, was the way they were their interests were increasingly in sort of having an atheist lifestyle, making fun of established religion, sometimes actually making fun of established gender relations. And feminists have often criticized Marx for neglecting this issue. Marx tends to see this stuff as non-serious and frivolous and not leading to any actual changes in state and society. And for that reason, when he became a newspaper editor and began to hang out with businessmen and politicians and people who were really aspiring to change things, I think he felt the young Hegelians were increasingly a frivolous lot. And the way this developed in his various critiques of fellow communists in the 1840s was that he sort of began to extend this criticism to argue that what a lot of these communist people like Proudhon or Karl Grun were doing was that they were trying to sort of smuggle communism into the existing capitalist society, sort of make it a lifestyle choice to join workers' cooperatives and Fourierist philanisteries and stuff, instead of seeing this as a political issue which would involve revolutionary social struggle with revolutionary ideas based on those of the French Revolution. So Marx sort of expanded this criticism of the early lifestyle-based young Hegelians into a broader criticism of communists. This is actually true of most communists in the 1840s, who were sort of skeptical of political struggle and imagined communism as being implemented by means of sort of changing people's opinions and lives and their social habits, rather than by overthrowing the government in violent fashion.
And also, in a sense, sort of changing people's ideas. I think isn't it fair to say that a lot of the critique of the true socialists is that, they saw the question simply of one as being one simply of people's ideas will change, and then the political change would follow.
Right. Or actually there wouldn't be a necessity for political change because people's ideas would be different, and then there'd just be no problem. Marx certainly was very well aware that people's ideas had to change, but he tended to see those changing ideas as emerging from political struggles.
Correct. Okay. Sunit's got another question for you.
I'd like to take us back a little bit to the sources of inspiration that you laid out and connect his critique of the young Hegelians to the developing sort of worldview of Marx's in the mid-1840s. And in the book, you argue that two articles sort of mark this intermediate period in a sense. The introduction to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of law and the review of Bruno Bauer's eponymous On the Jewish Question, both written for the Franco-German yearbooks. The two articles in important ways represent his attempt to digest Hegel's theory of modern society after the collapse of the Society of Orders and the apparent separation and antagonism of the state and civil society. And while the rhetoric, especially of On the Jewish Question, has forced, as you put it, Marx's defenders to tiptoe around the essay in embarrassed fashion, you take Marx's engagement with Bauer on the question of Jewish emancipation to mark a crucial stage in his development as a late Hegelian. And I was wondering how did Marx's stance on the Jewish question sort of mark a real crystallization of his thought?
All right. I should just say a word about the essay on the Jewish question. In the second part, in particular, Marx really lets loose on Jews and accuses them of being greedy and selfish and self-centered and capitalist, and saying that in a communist society, Judaism will cease to exist and Jews will no longer be an identifiable group. Seen from the point of view of the 20th century, from the Nazi and Stalinist persecution of the Jews, this is really sort of an embarrassing thing, and a lot of people have denounced Marx as an anti-Semite and a proto-Nazi and the like. One of the things I wanted to argue in the book is this is really involves, this is like a false perspective on this article. We need to go back to its 19th century context. And what we see here is Marx making a very interesting distinction between what he calls political emancipation and human emancipation. He argues that, as he says, the emancipation of the Jews, that is their granting of equal rights, granted to them equal rights with Christians, the creation of a society like in the United States, and Marx actually uses America as a specific example. He read Tocqueville on democracy in America and was very interested in this question. The separation of church and state marks a crucial step in the political emancipation and the completion of the program of the French Revolution. Now, if he'd stopped there, no one could have accused him of being an anti-Semite. But Marx, at this point, was understanding that the completion of the program of the French Revolution, the creation of a democratic republic, a society of people who are equal under the law, the end to discrimination on the basis of religion or race, well, it marked a step forward, if you will, historically from the old regime society of orders, created itself a society marked by alienation, by capitalist exploitation. And so in the second part of the essay on the Jewish question, the part that tends to offend people, he went on to argue that true human emancipation involves an end to this capitalist society of alienation, exploitation, of separation of society from the state and individual from society. This was the beginning of his Hegelian argument for the creation of a communist regime. Now, Marx was making, now of course when we think about this is sort of an odd argument. Marx was saying Jews need to be emancipated, they need to be free to act as citizens within civil society, but when they do that, all they're going to do is be rotten capitalist exploiters and make everybody miserable. So the question is, why would you want to bother doing this in the first place? What Marx was talking about here, and this becomes a central element in his political aspirations and a dilemma he would wrestle with for the subsequent 40 years, was how would it be possible to both complete the task of the French Revolution of overthrowing monarchies, of creating a democratic republic and a society of equal citizens, but also go beyond that to create a society, a communist society, a society in which alienation was abolished and individuals, society in the state and individuals in society, the distinctions were harmonized. Trying to carry out these two revolutions at once, and Marx understood them both as being revolutionary acts, was sort of difficult. They turned out to be, doing them both at the same time turned out not to be possible. And Marx was never quite able to find a way to resolve this issue. Well, he spent a lot of time thinking about it and acting on it.
One of the things that I thought was so, really bracing about the book is the way in which, and you've already brought this up, the way in which you argue that, Marx is really formed by the experience of the French Revolution, which really, of course, predated his birth. And I want to ask about this. I think it's one of the trickier aspects, and perhaps one that 20th century Marxists were really much less clear about, and that your sort of focus on Marx in his context. really zeroes in on. One major theme of your book is how the 19th century was overshadowed, not least for Marx, by the memory of the French Revolution. Specifically, Marx expected, and indeed, in perhaps the most famous passages of the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, described 19th century revolution as a repetition of the 18th century French Revolution, particularly in its 1789 to 1794 phase, sort of its ascendant phase. Thus, you describe Marx's thinking at the time of the Revolution of 1848 to 49 as follows. Using his influential position within the newly reorganized Communist League, Marx took scant time to rejoin the revolutionary fray. For a little over a year, from the spring of 48 to the spring of 49, Marx was, for the first and last time in his life, an insurgent revolutionary. Editing in brash, subversive style the New Rhineland News, becoming a leader of the radical Democrats of the city of Cologne and of the Prussian Rhineland, trying to organize the working class in Cologne and across Germany, and repeatedly encouraging and fomenting revolution. In all these activities, Marx persistently promoted the revolutionary strategy he'd first envisioned in his essay on the Jewish question, and would present in scintillating language in the Communist Manifesto. He pressed for a democratic revolution to destroy the authoritarian Prussian monarchy, and at the same time he aspired to organize the working class to carry out a communist uprising against the capitalist regime that he expected such a democratic revolution to establish. In effect, Marx was proposing a double recurrence of the French Revolution, a repetition of its 1789 to 94 phase in mid-19th century Prussia, and also a worker seizure of power. And then I know, I'm sorry for the length of the question, but it does go through, and you pick up on it again in your commentary on the manifesto, in which you say that the programmatic aspect of the manifesto is strongly influenced by the French Revolution, that the 10-point program was designed for a revolutionary government, one modeled on the radical or Jacobin phase of the French Revolution. So explain Marx's historical conception, in a sense, how he understands his moment in history. How and why does Marx, who is, after all, the great theorist of modernity's historical dynamism, simultaneously view history as subject to this sort of repetition, such that he expects the French Revolution past to return under changed 19th century conditions?
Well, maybe we need to revise our notions about Marx's attitude about modernity's historical dynamism. How's that for a suggestion?
Okay.
Marx, like most of his contemporaries, was in his thinking about politics, it centered on the French Revolution. This was a reality that just dominated Europe in the first two-thirds of the 19th century. When people thought about politics, they thought about it in terms of the French Revolution. And Marx was certainly no exception in that respect. What is interesting about Marx is this idea of what I like to call a double recurrence of the French Revolution. On the one hand, the French Revolution would literally recur in Central and Eastern Europe. There would be an uprising against the Prussian and the Austrian monarchies, their replacement with a revolutionary German republic, probably including a revolutionary war against the Tsar. This is something like a literal rerun of 1793 in mid-19th century Germany. But there will also be a recurrence by analogy of the French Revolution, in which Marx saw as a bourgeois seizure of power, bringing a feudal system or society of orders to an end and replacing it with a capitalist economy and bourgeois society. By analogy, the workers would do the same thing. They would overthrow capitalism and create a communist economy in society. And Marx, this is this idea, as I said, which first begins in his essay on the Jewish question. Marx tries to do both at once in 1848, and he finds it very, very difficult to do. He discovers if you're trying to overthrow the Prussian monarchy, you can't really can't get the workers riled up against the bourgeoisie, because the bourgeoisie then won't support you in overthrowing the Prussian monarchy. And in his speech to the Cologne Democratic Society in August 1848, he describes the class struggle as nonsense. Quite a radical suggestion. But of course, the problem was it wasn't clear that the flip side was that organizing the workers against the capitalists didn't necessarily mean opposing the Prussians. So it was difficult to get both of these going at once.
I guess what I meant by Marx is kind of a thinker of historical dynamism is the way that Marx thinks about industrialization.
Yeah.
And the way that his treatment of industrialization is as a kind of great accelerant that industrial society is constantly changing, and as soon as it changes again, and that in many ways the 19th century world for that reason looks so different than the 18th century, than the conditions that produced that produced the French Revolution. And that's what really struck me about the book, is that the way in which Marx is still holding on to this older model of French revolutionary politics under such vastly changed conditions and gargantuan cities and emerging
I really think that Marx here is primarily a backward-looking figure who, in this way, really is reading capitalism's future in its past, and seeing the future political crisis of capitalism being resolved by a revolutionary movement along the lines of the French Revolution. His whole economic vision of the future of capitalism, the labor theory of value, the falling rate of profit, is all based on ideas, particularly of David Ricardo, who wrote in the early 19th century, the early phase of the Industrial Revolution, and Marx saw these conditions as capitalism's, which were by the 1840s more like capitalism's past. He saw them as capitalism's future. For all Marx's invocation of dynamism and constant change, and we all know that passage about the Communist Manifesto about everything solid melting into air, which I've pointed out is an actual mistranslation of the original German. This dynamism and constant change all tends to end up in aspects of Marx's past.
Could I have you say very briefly, I did like the point that you made about that all that is solid melts into air, and perhaps you could gloss your retranslation?
Yeah, the German original, I guess this is the University of Chicago radio station. I can say the German original. It's Das Stehende und das Ständische vergeht. Verdampft, not vergeht. Das Stehende und das Ständische verdampft. Stehen und ständisch, they both come from the German verb to stand. It's sort of a pun. It means das Stehende, which exists, the current order, which seems so solid. Das Ständische, Ständisch refers to the society of orders, the old regime world, which still existed in Prussia and Austria. They will go up, they will evaporate, they will go up in smoke. And what Marx was suggesting here was that the power of capitalism would evaporate the society of orders, capitalist steam engines.
Yes, yeah. I mean, the metaphor, your retranslation sort of brings out the force of this industrial change.
Right, and it would also, and this is it would also like bring to an end the intellectual world that went along with it, romanticism and glorification of the Middle Ages, and replace it with the this comment at the end about this man will see the world with his sober senses, sort of bring about an age of realism. Literary realism, and one of Marx's friends, when he was in exile and in Paris, was Heinrich Heine, the great German early proto-realist. And so this is a very different take on the world. I think this is, in the 20th century, this passage has been interpreted as having to do with the the way capitalism produces all these new consumer demands. And we have a world which is constantly changing, communications, artistic trends, the whole deal. I think that's a 20th century reinterpretation of Marx's ideas.
If I could take you to a question about the internationalism of Marx's context and of 1848.
Yeah.
You say that one of Marx's least successful predictions from the Communist Manifesto is that of the imminent end of nations and nationalism. and quoting you, national distinctiveness and conflicts between nations disappear more and more with the development of the bourgeoisie, with free trade, the world market, the uniformity of industrial production, and the relations of life corresponding to them.
I think that's actually
that's Marx. Yeah, I realized that
yes.
as soon as I said that. Thank you. As you note, the resurgence of nationalism in pre-1914 Europe belies any straightforward affirmation of what Marx wrote. But as you also note, Marx's view nevertheless contained an element of truth rooted in Marx's own experience. Marx had participated, after all, in the London Fraternal Democrats and the Brussels Democratic Association, both of which were based on the cooperations of radicals of different nationalities. And of course, Marx, whose own perspective was resolutely internationalist, went on to participate in other organizations dedicated to international cooperation. Given this, might we not take Marx's observation in the Communist Manifesto as indicating, if not straightforward dissolution of nationalism, then its substantial, if subtle, transformation from British patriotism or later French revolutionary nationalism of the 18th century? And in the history of European nationalism, how does the revolution of 1848 serve as a watershed moment? How did Marx and Engels relate to post-1848 nationalisms, particularly Polish and Irish, and we can treat the German case later, and how did this shape their political outlook?
Well, the early advocates of nationalism in 19th century, or the first half of the 19th century, tended to envisage antagonisms and military conflicts between different countries as a result of, the lusts of monarchs for conquest, glory, and expansion of their domains. They imagined that when states were ruled by nations, by peoples, this would all come to an end. Nationalities would spontaneously cooperate with each other. This is the idea of Giuseppe Mazzini, the leading Democrat in Europe in the 1830s and 40s. His famous organization, Young Italy and then Young Europe, designed to be an alliance of different nationalist groups against the existing monarchical order. The Brussels Democratic Association has an absolutely fabulous name. Let me read it to you. The Democratic Association, having as goal the union and fraternity of all peoples. That's terrific, isn't that? But that expresses exactly what nationalists thought. Now, in 1848, indeed, the old regimes are swept away, and we see increasingly nationalist governments in power, and the first thing that happens is all these different nationalisms go to war with each other. Particularly in the Austrian Empire, where the Germans and the Slavs, the Hungarians and the Germans and the Italians, they're all at war with each other. This also, to some extent, happens in Prussia with the Germans and the Poles, and it really becomes very, very clear that nationalist movements are deeply and profoundly antagonistic. Nationalism is a militaristic and bellicose sort of ideology which encourages warfare. This is a big disappointment to nationalists, left them angry and frustrated. Marx and Engels developed somewhat, I might say, an instrumental relationship to nationalism. There were some they liked. Marx was a big fan of Polish nationalism because it was violently anti-Russian, and he saw the destruction of the Tsar's empire as a central revolutionary step. They liked Irish nationalism, too. I think this is in part relates to the fact that Engels had two Irish mistresses, and both Marx and Engels came to know Irish nationalism in a personal way. And Marx's oldest daughter, Jenny, who followed her father's political footsteps, became a left-wing journalist in her own right. She wrote mostly about her support for Irish nationalism, not for communism or the labor movement. And so they had this sort of instrumental attitude. Eventually they came to see Irish nationalism as a good thing because they were hoping a revolution in Ireland would destroy the position of the landowning Anglo-Irish aristocracy, which would be a blow to English capitalism and sort of capitalism worldwide. But there were lots of other nationalisms they didn't like. They didn't like the nationalism of the Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe, which tended to be anti-German and pro-Russian. In Engels' book Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Germany, which is a sort of post-mortem on the 1848 revolution, he states that if we're going to have another revolution and the Czechs are opposed to our German revolution, we're just going to kill all of them. It's basically sort of rather, well, they're frankly genocidal threats. And we see here the way that this is sort of disillusioned nationalism. All nationalities will not spontaneously fraternize with each other, and so it's necessary to treat nationalism as an issue of its usefulness for revolutionary goals.
Professor Sperber, just if you could hold on 1 minute,
Sure.
we're going to do some station identifications and public service announcements. You're listening to WHPK 88.5 FM, and this is Radical Minds. And here is a public service announcement or two.
It might be the door alarm, or the new safety drain covers, the pool fencing, even the swim lessons. But the fact is, you can never know which safety step will save a life until it does. Adding multiple safety steps to your safe pool practices can mean the difference between a close call and a call to 911. Simple steps save lives. To learn some new ones, visit poolsafely.gov. A public service message from the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission, the American Red Cross, and YMCA of the USA.
Hello, this is Julia Louis-Dreyfus asking you to join me in helping to protect our national parks. Our parks will celebrate their 100th anniversary in 2016, but these magnificent places, from Yosemite to Gettysburg, are suffering from numerous challenges such as air and water pollution, development threats outside their boundaries, and inadequate funding. And that's why the National Parks Conservation Association has identified proposed actions to help protect our natural and cultural heritage for future generations. Find out more at www.mpca.org.
Okay, sorry about that, Dr. Sperber. I want to remind everyone that we are discussing Karl Marx, A 19th Century Life, with Professor Jonathan Sperber. This is his recently published book, available now in hardcover and as an ebook, and soon to come out as a paperback. Now, to carry on this question of Marx's politics in the 19th century, and to one more time on since 1848. I know that you are a historian of this revolution, and this is a revolution that I think perhaps is not known well enough. This, of course, was Marx and Engels' revolution. On the editorial policy of the New Rhineland News, or the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, Marx's stint as an active revolutionary was spent editing this newspaper in the western German city of Cologne. Reminiscing about the paper in later years, Engels asserted that war with Russia and the creation of a united German republic were the paper's two main themes. Explain the logic of this editorial policy and, more generally, the strategic orientation of the paper vis-à-vis other socialists. So you mentioned, among others, Andreas Gottschalk in Cologne, whom you describe as a true socialist and a friend, pupil, and close confidant of the young Hegelian philosopher Moses Hess. Now, you don't, of course, say true socialists as opposed to false socialists, but that this is what they called themselves. In other words, what was Marx's political aim in the Revolution of 1848, perhaps as he entered into it, and how did his political development over the previous half-decade prepare him for the role that he came to play as editor-in-chief of the New Rhineland News, and how did his position evolve over the course of that revolution?
All right, you remember I talked about this idea of the double recurrence of the French Revolution. There would be the literal recurrence in Prussia and Austria, complete with the Jacobin Republic and Revolutionary War, and then there'd be the analogous recurrence of a workers' uprising against capitalism. Marx came into 1848 with big aspirations to do both at once. He had this sort of double-track political strategy. He would go back to Cologne. He would edit this newspaper, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, which would represent the Jacobin wing of his strategy that would call for a united German republic, revolutionary war with Russia, the overthrow of the Prussian monarchy, and Marx, the newspaper, spent a lot of time, really socking it to the Prussians, making fun of the monarch, the royal family, government officials, tax collectors, army officers, constantly stirring up the population against them. The Prussian officials got really angry with Marx for this because he was so good at that. It reflected the fact that in their western provinces they were deeply hated by the population. The other thing that Marx wanted to do was to organize the workers, to form a nationwide German Workers' Association, which would prepare for a new revolutionary struggle against the capitalists once his democratic republic was achieved. The first part, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, the Jacobin part, worked out pretty well. Marx got good at that. The Workers' Association thing did not work out so well. Marx's working class followers were pretty much unable to do this. They spent a lot of time in the cafes drinking and playing dominoes rather than organizing the workers. And in Cologne itself, where there was a very large workers' association, something like one adult male and 3 in the city belonged to it. It was led by this guy Gottschalk, who was, well, to be honest, Gottschalk and his mentor Moses Hess, I think it would be fair to describe them in contemporary terminology as airheads, as fabulists, as people who believed that everybody was in favor of communism, and all you needed to do was just wait a little while, and communism would sort of emerge out of itself. Gottschalk was notorious for refusing to take part in political campaigns. He sabotaged the elections to the German National Assembly by calling the Democrats bourgeois frauds and calling on the workers not to vote, which enabled the Catholic conservatives in Cologne to dominate the election. He refused to join the Republican and anti-Prussian campaigns. He was really screwing everything up. All the Democrats in Cologne were extremely hostile to Gottschalk. Marx was no exception in this respect, and Gottschalk was arrested by the Prussian government in June of 1848. Marx and his followers gained control of the Workers' Association, and they tried to use it to support the Democrats, and the association basically collapsed. It had almost no members. So Marx found himself throughout most of the revolution pursuing the Democratic and Jacobin part of his political program. In September and October and November of 1848, period of revolutionary crises, Marx was busy stirring up efforts to overthrow the Prussian government. November came pretty close to succeeding at that, I have to say. And continued in this phase until sort of the very end of the revolution in the spring of 1849, when he suddenly changed his mind and decided he really wanted to organize the workers again, and broke with the Democrats, with the movement for German national unity, and sort of stood aside at that last revolutionary crisis in May of 1849. It's this odd back and forth pattern. He would do something similar with the International Working Men's Association. And what we see here, once again, was the difficulty Marx had in getting both of his, both prongs of this double recurrence of the French Revolution to work simultaneously. Germans could get one going, but not the other.
Go ahead.
If I could pick up on the question of the International, then.
You're going to have to speak up again.
Forgive me. I was saying that I'd like to pick up on this question of the International and the what Marx's sort of aims for it were. As the U.S. Civil War reached a revolutionary pitch and Polish nationalists rose in revolt against the Tsar, Marx came to help form the International Working Men's Association. Respecting Marx's involvement and its original aims, you write, and forgive me, there's a long quote here, Marx's plans for the association appeared in his agenda for the first Congress of the International Working Men's Association. The items for auction included the advocacy of social reform, a shorter workday, limitations on women and children's labor, the replacement of indirect with direct taxation, international inquiry into workplace conditions, and the endorsement of producers, cooperatives, and trade unions. There were just two expressly political points: both taken from the arsenal of 19th century radicalism, to return to a theme that we've had on the table thus far. The replacement of standing armies with militias, and the necessity of annihilating the Muscovite influence in Europe via the reconstitution of Poland on a social and democratic basis. Starting from this basis, how did the International Working Men's Association evolve? What developments did it face, and what were the central tensions within it? And what were the primary aims Marx sought to advance in his struggles over the direction of the First International? How did these evolve into a struggle with the Russian anarchist Bakunin, and what was at stake there?
All right. As you can see, your quote indicates, Marx, one might think of Marx's attitudes towards the International Working Men's Association as not involving any specifically revolutionary goals. And I think Marx saw the IWMA primarily in terms of these workplace-related, trade union-related elements of social reform. Now, Marx believed these would ultimately be revolutionary in nature because it comes from his theory of surplus value, in which capitalists gain their profits by taking part of the product that workers have produced. Marx saw unions as trying to seize some of that surplus value back from the capitalists, and he tended to hope that if this continued long enough with the support of the IWMA, which was very big on supporting strikes and union organizing, that this would tend to reduce capitalist profits and lead to a crisis of capitalism, which would be ultimately revolutionary in nature. That's sort of a long-term strategy. It's going to take quite a while for this to work out. Marx was supported in these ideas by the English trade unionists, who formed the backbone of the IWMA, and 50,000 or so of them affiliated with it, provided the organization with most of its rather meager finances. The opponents of Marx were revolutionary adherents of secret societies who saw the IWMA as a way to overthrow the existing order in Europe, probably for communist purposes, but were interested above all in this idea of secret society organization. Not so much Bakunin at first as the followers of the French revolutionary Louis-Auguste Blanqui, who spent the entire 19th century, or the years 1830 to the 1870s, plotting revolutions, trying them out, going to jail, being released, and plotting new revolutions. There were two things, I think, that created tensions within the IWMA. One was its spread from Northern and Western Europe, where it began, into Southern Europe, into Italy and Spain, countries where there wasn't a whole lot of trade unionism or workers' associations, but where the tradition of secret societies was very lively and very active. And the other thing that created a disruptive element was the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, which disrupted politics all across the European continent. Marx was actually not at first hostile to Bakunin. The two were friends. They'd met in exile in France in the 1840s. Marx was always very impressed with Bakunin. In the 1860s, when he saw him again after about 15 years, he wrote to Engels that Bakunin was one of the few people who moved forward in this interval rather than backward. He really liked them. But Bakunin, who was an enormous fan of secret societies and just loved them, became involved with some very dubious ones, like the one by the Russian Nekhaev, whose machinations were famously portrayed in Dostoevsky's The Possessed. Found himself in Marx increasingly in opposition, an opposition that got sort of angrier, I think, as tensions between Latin and Germanic countries got stirred up by the war between France and Prussia, and eventually led to a break between the two and a struggle for control of the International Working Men's Association. Mm-hmm. As part of this struggle, Marx decided the IWMA had to endorse the idea of workers' political parties. This was an idea which we knew there were very few such workers' political parties in existence at the time, two competing ones in Germany, neither of whom Marx entirely trusted. It led to a ferocious struggle between Marx and his followers, and frankly every other element in the IWMA. In the 1872 Hague Conference, Marx and his followers were victorious. They expelled Bakunin, but then they moved the headquarters of the IWMA to New York, basically with the intent of destroying the organization. Marx, realizing his plans for revolution were probably not going to occur after the repression of the Paris Commune. And that was the point at which basically Marx controlled the organization and then proceeded to terminate it, to bring it to an end.
Would you? I mean, to what extent would you say that this sort of impulse towards sort of open, democratic political activity formed a kind of preoccupation of Marx's? Obviously, the Communist League, after the reverses of 1849, does adopt a kind of secretive underground organizational form, but this in some ways repeats Marx's original struggle with the Communist League in 1847. This sort of impulse of Marx towards sort of open politics, publication, running newspapers. So how do you see that as a kind of continuation?
Yeah, I do. The Communist League does adopt this strategy of clandestinity in Germany in 1849 to 51, but that's because, largely open political activity is increasingly impossible in an age of post-revolutionary repression. But Marx was always a proponent of open politics. Like you say, he was a newspaper editor. That was one of his chief forms of political activism. He believed in that sort of political activity. He was always suspicious of secret societies. One of the ironies about the thing with Bakunin is that Marx was convinced that Bakunin was trying to undermine the International Working Men's Association by sort of smuggling his followers in and sort of bring them as a secret society into the group. This was actually not the case. The person who was proposing this was, ironically, one of Marx's allies, the veteran German revolutionary Johann Philipp Becker, a man who'd gotten into politics in the age of secret societies around 1830, and Marx just sort of flew off the handle at Becker's proposals and thought Becker was just being a tool, being manipulated by an evil Bakunin, who was, after all, a Russian, whom Marx was very suspicious of Russians. This was what brought about the break. Marx himself came to realize, I think, later on, this probably wasn't true, and maybe this whole strategy of having gotten so worked up with Bakunin was probably not an ideal way to do things.
If I could interrupt to
Sure.
Sort of take us to the continuation, or in some sense the inheritors of Marx's mantle. Two of Marx and Engels' key associates in the German...
You got to speak up again because I'm losing you.
Yes, forgive me, I'm less experienced at this than Spencer is, who's the regular host here. Two of Marx and Engels' key associates in the German workers' movement were Ferdinand Lassalle and Wilhelm Liebknecht. Eventually, however, it was Liebknecht who opposed Lassalle's coziness with Prussian nationalism that came to enjoy Marx and Engels' support. One crucial division between the two, and what eventually divided Lassalle from Marx as well, was again the question of nationalism. As veterans of 1848, they all supported, in some sense, the cause of Germany, but Marx articulated this as an anti-Prussian demand for a German republic. Yet in the face of eventual German unification enforced by the Prussian Chancellor Bismarck, Marx and Liebknecht were forced to make something of it, and this meant coming to some sort of terms with the followers of Lassalle. What were the fundamental underlying tensions expressed by Liebknecht's opposition to the Lassallians, and to what extent were these overcome?
All right, I think there were three issues here that were important in this sort of opposition. One One was the question of the nature of a united German nation state. Would it be, as contemporaries said, a Großdeutsch German nation state, that is, including the ethnic Germans in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or the Austrian Empire, actually, at the time? Or would it be a Kleindeutsch German nation state, excluding those Germans, and thus dominated by Prussia? Marx was always a Großdeutsch German nationalist. He hated the Prussians. Liebknecht was his follower and agreed with him on that point. LaSalle strongly differed on this point of view. This one was decided by war. The Prussians trounced the Austrians in 1866. Bismarck's united German nation state would be Kleindeutsch and dominated by Prussia. This was a fait accompli. Marx was not happy with this, but as a realist, he understood he would have to come to terms with it. The second issue that separated the two was the issue of whether there would be a German nation state would be a democratic republic or not. Liebknecht, as a veteran of the Revolution of 1848, was a strong adherent of the idea of a German democratic republic. He was anti-monarchist. LaSalle was too. LaSalle was also a revolutionary veteran of 1848, but he was willing to play footsie with the Prussian monarchy. He would have these famous conspiratorial meetings with Bismarck. He was willing to consider the possibility of not being in favor of a republic. This too got decided the fait accompli. The United German Nation State in the 1870s persecuted both the followers of LaSalle and of Liebknecht equally, and LaSalle's followers increasingly became opponents of the existing monarchical order. The third question, and this was the one that was really the tricky one, was the question of relations between the labor movement on the one hand and the liberal and progressive political parties in the Prussian government on the other. LaSalle and his followers clearly despised the liberals. They were far more willing to work with the government authorities. Liebknecht, by contrast, was more inclined to make deals with at least the left wing of the liberals, the progressives and the Democrats, and not particularly inclined to take up with the Prussian authorities or the conservatives. This was a issue that even after the two wings, the pro and the anti-Prussian wings of the labor movement united in the famous Gotha Congress of 1875, this was an issue that remained alive in the German Socialist Party. There continued to be people who felt that opposing liberalism should be their primary aim, even if that meant cooperating with conservatives and the authorities. And there continues to be people who felt that opposing conservatives and the authorities should be the primary aim, even if that meant cooperating with the liberals. There
Professor
was a
Sperber,
mention there that was never entirely resolved.
We're gonna have to end there. Okay. I want to thank you so much for joining us. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
It was a pleasure to do that with you. I've had a number of interviews, but this has been one at a very high intellectual level, which I would expect from the University of Chicago. Well, so I've really enjoyed this.
That's very kind of you. Thank you so much.
Sure.
And I want to say one more time, everyone should rush out to their local bookstore and grab a copy, because it's really quite a read. So I'll be in touch with you, Professor Sperber,
okay.
Presently. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Generation. Pay attention.